Well, good morning, afternoon, or evening. I'm Professor Rios, and welcome to the last two lessons of the climate change course. These two lessons are technically not climate change per se, but they're more of an application, specifically dealing with the now rather old discipline of environmental security. Environmental security predates really all the hype and all the news coverage of climate change by quite a while, and it has evolved over time to encompass many other things. There are many definitions of it. These two lessons do not aim to make you an expert in it, as you could literally have entire multi semester courses just on environmental security, but this is to give you an idea, get you introduced to the topic, something that isn't necessarily addressed by the media directly. It is often referred to it indirectly. So anyway, having said that, there are two lessons. One is environmental security and the Sahel, which is a region in Africa, and the other one is one dealing with the United States. So to give you two different levels, to different sides of, frankly, development. Okay, so this will hopefully give you a big, broad view of environmental security. We will begin, again, here's one, environmental security in sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel, and the other one, environmental security and climate change in the US. So we will begin with this one. So let's get going and put this in presentation mode. And it's the idea of environmental stressors in fragile places. And when I say fragile, that implies this region of Africa referred to as the Sahel. When climate change and variability often tip the scales, and often in a not so great way. So first, defining environmental security, and this definition that I'm about to give you is kind of old. It's probably older than most of you, but I still like it. You can find, frankly, dozens of definitions that have been developed over the years. I still like this one, the freedom from social and economic instability due to environmental stressors and degradation. And that could be as a result of many things, okay? The environment can act as a trigger or an exacerbating force, meaning makes it worse when it comes to conflict. And then social or economic instability is directly related to the quality of the environment in many instances. This definition is adopted from a paper by Glenn and others in 1998, so it's already that old, but I like it. I think it's really, really well done, and frankly still rather applicable here in the mid-2020s. Again, while this definition may seem dated, it is still just as applicable. So, climate risk and a baseline. So, this number goes back and forth. It used to be 2, now it's 1.5, but some people are thinking it should be 2 again. In any event, what does this number mean? So this is the global temperature threshold beyond which irreversible and lasting damage may be hard to overcome. The problem is, between 1880 and 2019, temperature has increased per the IPCC 1.09 degrees Celsius, right? That's the AR6 number. However, it's been quite a while since 2019 already, and in 2021 it was closer to 1.1. In 2025 it was closer to 1.43. So as you can see, we are already close to that 1.5 magic number. It isn't a magic number. Things aren't suddenly going to magically change if we go beyond 1.5. Changes often are steady but slow. It's not an immediate, oh my God, we hit 1.5 now, it's all hell breaking loose from here on out. there is a sort of like gradual change that begins to take place. But it is a number, and you have to pick a number if you want to think of a climatic risk baseline against which to view future issues, right? So anyway, 1.5 has been chosen. It may be changed to 2. I don't know. Stay tuned on that one. Climate risk baseline, and this is from AR6 Working Group 2, which, if you'll recall, deals with adaptation. This is from the Summary of Policy Makers. So this is the idea of risk, and how do you foster resiliency in development, health, well-being, equity, justice, those kinds of things. Oftentimes you had to take into account risks, and that includes, what are the climate hazards, would be that darker color, what's the vulnerability, and what is the exposure that a population may have. And this depends, frankly, on where you are. If you're in the United States or Europe or some parts of Asia, not all parts of Asia, that vulnerability is much smaller than if you live in, frankly, sub-Saharan Africa. It's just the way it is. This is not a judgment call, it's just stating the fact. Climate hazards really can affect any area of the world, and depending on where you are, those may manifest themselves differently in the form of stronger storms or drought or floods, or pick one. Right? So climate hazards are irrespective of region. Again, depending on where you are, obviously, if you're in the tropics, you're not going to have cold snaps, for example. But again, climate hazards are what they are. The vulnerability and the exposure really depends on the population. And that often is tied to how developed or underdeveloped that region may or may not be. Environmental security, again, spans a broad cross-section of topics: natural disasters, water, soil, food, border security, military installations, which is frankly where it began, at least sort of in a large-scale form, and of course, geopolitics. Can't get away from that. In this particular set of lessons, I'm going to focus on, obviously, natural disasters, how it may affect populations, food, borders, that kind of thing. Again, you could literally do a course on environmental security on each one of these topics, all on their own. Just that. So again, it is exceptionally broad in scope. So the Sahel, this magical region that I've been talking about. So the Sahel is what is referred to as an ecotone, which is simply a transition between the Sahara to the north and the wetter savanna and tropical rainforests to the south. It is an area that is very seasonal. So it never rains in winter, or rarely, if ever, rains in winter. And the rains typically fall in the summer, as you can see by that little graphic there, in a town in Niger called Niamey, which is, I believe, the capital. So no precipitation, as you can see. It rains starting in May and it ends in September, October. So you have a wet period during which planting and agriculture takes place, and then a very, very predictable dry season. And that is basically as the sun moves north and south with the seasons, right? So that is what the Sahel is. And so what's the physical and cultural settings of this area? So you have environmental stressors, things that can lead to, damaging consequences, variability and change, the interrelationship between human and natural processes. Again, how do you view the Sahel in terms of linear and non-linear interactions? One thing has a second, third, and fourth order effect, which are often difficult to predict. Okay? And so we'll talk about this region in a little bit more detail. So over the last 50 years or so, the combined effects of population growth, land degradation, reduced and or erratic rainfall has really affected this region, considering that this region is still the fastest growing in terms of population. Okay, so if you want to think about this region in terms of the physical setting, it has 11 states, 1.17 million square miles, so it's about 1/3 the size of the US. It's about 100 million inhabitants, expected to grow to around 200 by 2050. That's really not that far away. It has a seasonal climate, as we talked about, and just 2 river basins. Okay? In addition to that, there are many other human factors like border and water security concerns. The physical setting, so again, seasonality is the word that describes this region. If you look there at the northern hemisphere, precipitation minimum and maximum, the minimum is in March, notice, and lack of blue and green. And then in September, the rain band has moved north. And there you see a little bit of green and blue colors. In terms of vegetation, well, it follows, right? If it rains less in March, you're going to have less vegetation. And the opposite, of course, in September. So the Sahel kind of straddles this region right about here. If you go too far north, desert. So it's dry all the time. And if you head too far south, you're in basically the Congo, which is one of the 3 major tropical rainforests on Earth, which means is constantly wet. Now here's the cultural setting of this region. So you have colonial boundaries that were superimposed on the region. You have the intersection of Islam, Christianity, and tribal religions. HIV/AIDS, still a big deal in this. Getting better, absolutely getting better, but still a problem. Young populations, greater than 50% of the population is younger than 15 years of age, which is not the case in the US. We're an aging culture. So it's a very, very complex cultural landscape, and probably one of the more complex cultural landscapes on the planet. Okay, and a cultural landscape is nothing more than the human imprint on the natural setting. Okay, so this is the idea of the cultural boundaries, the boundaries that were imposed. So the one on the right is how the Berlin Congress of Africa, how colonial powers basically divvied up Africa long ago in the 1800s. And if you think about the actual cultural boundaries that Africans observe in terms of, tribes and tribal allegiances, it's a lot more complicated. A quick example, while I worked at West Point, I had students from Cameroon, which is right here. And these 2 students didn't know each other's tribal language. However, they defaulted to French when they spoke to each other, because that's the colonial language that's still a very strong part of Cameroonian life. And they both know French, but they couldn't understand each other's tribal language, even though they are from an area very, very close to each other. So that gives you a sense of how complex this cultural setting actually is. The cultural setting also implies the contrast between religions. So in the dark green is a predominantly Muslim area. In the white or outside of there, you have either a Muslim minority, or either Christianity is strong and or tribal religions. Boko Haram is basically a set of terror actors. You have Boko Haram, you have Al Qaeda in Africa, you have ISIS. They may not be in the news much recently, but they still basically operate within this region. So that makes things complicated. The idea of subsistence farmers versus nomadic herders. Okay, when you think about the idea of nomadic herding, you basically go where the conditions are best. And oftentimes, you're not really observing borders. They don't mean that much to you because this has been part of your cultural heritage going back many, many generations. So it's the idea of transhumans, people moving about a location which may or may not be within the same current state. And by state, I mean places like Ghana, Cameroon, Nigeria, and so on. That's what I mean by that. The cultural setting. So here's one, the idea of poverty and HIV prevalence. Again, this is somewhat dated. I will fully admit that. And this is as of 2017. And these numbers are getting better, thankfully. However, that's still a big deal. So that's a health condition that obviously plays a big role in how a country deals with itself, its health care, resources that had to be spent to fight that, and education, medication, that kind of stuff. And so this also plays a role in their cultural setting. So think of this as a layer underneath, and you put in climate change on top of that. This is where this is headed. Climate change is sort of like the big top level process going on, which affects everybody. However, how is that affecting a particular region that may or may not be well suited or postured to handle what it throws at it? Here's one dealing with fertility rate. So fertility rate is nothing more than the number of children born to a woman during her reproductive years. Okay? And this is roughly from age 15 to 45. Yes, I said 15. In many parts of the world, that is a perfectly acceptable time for a woman to give birth. I know that may not sound right to you, but again, you have to take away your sort of American glasses and look at the world differently. And not everybody views the world the way we do. So just FYI. Here's an example of population. So these are different countries. We have Mali, we have Somalia, we have Chad. And notice how they are very young, right? The lower bars are very heavy or very big. Heavy is probably the wrong term. But here it gives you the fertility rate, 5.6, 5.1, 5.5. And then here is Chad. So Chad in 2025, Chad in 2050. Now, still a lot more young people than elderly. However, notice the difference in shape of that population pyramid. And a population pyramid is nothing more than the female and the male sides split into 5-year groupings. That's really all. And it gives you a chance to see how population changes over time. Here's the United States. Our fertility rate is below 2, which is replacement level. We're an aging country. So in our lower or younger groups, notice how they're getting a little bit narrower. I would expect that in the next 10 to 20 years, these bottom bars will be even smaller because people are not having as many kids as in the past. And we are getting older and lasting longer because healthcare is better. Again, you may disagree with how available healthcare may be, but the quality of it is better, just as a function of technological advancement. So you're going to have people in what would be basically the older age groups move up and be a little bit wider than they currently are. So that's, the United States, that's what our population pyramid looks like. Compare that to these. Of course, we have the idea of hunger and how that is a factor. This is a bit dated, I will fully admit it, and I haven't been able to find anything relatively newer, but this gives you at least an idea. 70% of Africans depend on agriculture as their livelihood, and they often use marginal lands, and because of that and overpopulation, yields are not particularly good. This can often be a magnifier of conflict, especially if corruption is an issue. Okay? And many parts of Africa suffer from crippling corruption. And corruption is true of basically every part of Earth, but the corruption that many African states suffer from is far, far worse. It's not only worse, it's more violent. And as a result, the general population is basically the one that ends up suffering. Working Group 1 projections beyond 2021. So here's the idea of possible scenarios in most of Africa. Increased average temperatures and rising faster than the global average. Okay, and that is set by them with a significant bit of confidence. Okay, these are two possible scenarios. Okay, based on different global models. Around 2 degrees Celsius increase by 2100, so 2 degrees Celsius, so that would be an additional half a degree from current, with much worse scenarios in the 4 to 6 degree range. This is, in my opinion, far less likely, because this would be catastrophic, but hard to say. At this point, I would say this scenario here is far less likely. This one looks pretty reasonable, again, in my opinion. Desertification can be a catalyst for instability. Again, desertification is defined by the UN as land degradation in arid and semi-arid regions, and is redefined by some as this. So this can be a contributor to local and regional instability at the intra and interstate level. So intra means within a state. So imagine an argument between Buffalo and Albany, right? Intrastate, within it. Or interstate, New York and New Jersey. Oh, border. You cross the border in there. So that's what those two inter definitions mean. Again, desertification in the Sahel, 1968 through 1993 was one of the worst droughts ever observed in that region, at least in recorded history. And unfortunately, this drought coincided with the end of colonial, mostly French rule in the region. And as a result, it really impacted people especially badly. So this JJASO is June through October. Okay, so that's typically the rainy season in this region. Okay, and so if you think about it, if the rains usually come during that period and they don't come in a particular year, they're not going to come in winter. So you kind of have to wait a whole other season for the rains to show up. That's a problem, especially when most of your agriculture is what is referred to as rain-fed, meaning you rely on that water that's falling from the sky. There's no reservoirs, there's no irrigation systems, at least the way we think of them. So you are typically relying on rainfall to provide the water you need for your crops. Again, here's the idea of climate variability and change. Per the IPCC, this would be temperature. And so this would be the simulated 1.5 degree global warming, which we're kind of close to that now. a 2-degree warming, and a 4-degree warming. In terms of precipitation, long-range forecast, frankly uncertain. And the problem with this is the rainfall in this region is convection. And if you have ever been in Florida during a thunderstorm, you know that, or if you've ever lived in an area that's warm, like the tropics, the Caribbean, or the southern United States, you know that convection can be very hit or miss. You could be in town A and get 3 inches of rain, and 3 or 4 miles away you get nothing. You've probably all experienced that. That's very different than the rainfall we get up in New York, which is a lot more spatially reliable. Okay, so precipitation in this region, again, the 2 possible scenarios are modest increase in rainy season, and similar patterns notice over western and eastern Sahel. However, because precipitation forecasts in tropical regions are a lot more unreliable, these projections by the IPCC are also best guesses, quite frankly. And here's one thing about precipitation. More precipitation doesn't necessarily mean better. And that's because in a place that relies on convection or tropical kind of precipitation, if you get it all at once, that doesn't do you any good. Because sure, you may have gotten a lot of precipitation, but it all fell in a few days or weeks, and then you got nothing the rest of your growing season. So that can be problematic. And here's some of the maps. You can look at these on your own and how they're forecasting at the 1.5, 2, and 4 degree changes. This is based on AR6 Working Group 1 Summary for Policymakers. So the Sahel, what is at risk? You have water security, food security, or insecurity, if you want to think of it that way. And so here's how I want to end this. So imagine climate change as the overarching topic, right? The overarching layer against which you view this region. So imagine then how that affects human security. So the idea of forced migration, insecure borders, terror actors. And forced migration may lead to what are referred to as climate refugees. So if, for example, things aren't great where you are more likely to move somewhere else. And that may be good for you, but how is that for the receiving population? Insecure borders and terror actors, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, these are still actors that are operating. They may not be in the news much, but they're still operating. These have not gone away. Okay? So that's the idea of human security. You can think of economic insecurity. So over-reliance on non-governmental organizations. This would be things like the United Nations, Doctors Without Borders, those kind of organizations. Or greater poverty, like livelihood loss. Health security. So the idea of vector and waterborne diseases. So if you change the climate, you may change where the water is. And a lot of diseases are carried by mosquitoes. And so if that forces a change in their basically regional or spatial coverage, that may have an impact on health security over this region. Food security, again, decreased productivity, pest, disease, subsistence output. That's a problem. And water security. So when you think about this, all the connections that happen between all these. So health insecurity might lead to economic insecurity. Food security may lead to economic insecurity. Food security may lead to water issues and vice versa. If you don't have enough water, your food production systems may suffer because you do not have irrigation systems like we do here in the U.S. Human water security, if there's lack of water, that can lead to the human security factor, which may lead people to form alliances with terror actors as a function of desperation. And again, this is a worst case type of scenario, but you can see how one domino may lead to another domino and so on and so on. So this is all the different sort of connections that I could think of. There's probably more, but this gives you an idea how climate change in an underdeveloped region of the world that is quickly growing may actually lead to several forms of insecurity. So that basically concludes this specific presentation. Now I'm going to minimize this one and bring the one about the United States. And this one's a different tone altogether. So let me put this in presentation mode. So many people have asked me, why is there an iceberg in the front cover of this presentation? I don't know. I really don't. In any event, so in the United States, it can be a policymaking and security conundrum, which is nothing more than like something that is confusing and difficult to predict. So, think about the idea of, and these are kind of dated events by now, 2005, Katrina and Rita, 2012, Sandy, 1992, Andrew, 1989, Hugo. There have been far stronger hurricanes since these four, like, for example, Hurricane Michael in Florida. You have Hurricane Harvey in Texas, which led to ridiculous amount of rainfall in the Houston area and flooded the majority of that city for weeks. So think of homeland security, natural disasters, and possible climate tipping points. And think of a tipping point as if you have a teeter-totter, right? And it's sort of balanced, and you put a heavy weight on one end of it, it'll go in that direction. And once it goes in that direction, it kind of stays in that direction. Or it's difficult to bring it back. But these tipping points can lead to really, really expensive outcomes, like billions of dollars worth of outcomes. So again, gives you a sense of what you have here. So, in the United States, we have a ballooning national debt, that much as of 2026, political turmoil, inflation, thinly stretched Department of Defense, and this really depends on administration. This really depends on who's in charge and what kind of emphasis they have placed on that. So again, it varies from administration to administration. Employment is uncertain in an age of AI and what's happening and companies doing about faces with AI, going to it, coming back from it. Hard to tell where things are headed in that direction. So there's uncertainty, even in a place as developed as the United States. This is true in Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America, Central America, anywhere really on Earth. It varies from place to place, but there's uncertainty, especially in such a highly complex, globalized societies. So, so the president has to consider climate change as a matter of state policy. How would you advise said individual? And again, if there was one aspect of climate change, one second or third order effect that you could argue for, what would it be? I am always thinking of coastlines and sea level, because cities in the United States and everywhere else on Earth have been primarily established near coastlines. and coastlines change. Coastlines will change. And you have to think about, right now it's not that big a deal, but in the future it will be, because sea level will rise and sea level will drop too. But because we're such brief temporal creatures, it's hard to think in those type of temporal scales. Okay? So, the focus today is climate offers an almost infinite array of possible scenarios. Again, the human versus the natural, the adaptation versus mitigation issues. A lot of people personally, this is just me, I'm a bigger believer in adaptation than mitigation. Mitigation's fine and you should strive for it, but adaptation is for the here and now. Mitigation does nothing for you if the fix is going to manifest itself 30 years down the road. You want to fix what's happening now. Okay? So you sort of should work on both. Again, the good and the bad. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we've addressed on that. Again, the state of the science, a quest for understanding. Again, the baseline, as you well know, 2021 and 2022, AR6. And this will be changing in 2027 and 2028. Or 2028 and 2029, actually, because I believe it is every 7 years. So stay tuned for that, AR7. And then, of course, climate change and United States policy. And again, this changes, and it changes with administration. That's just a reality of the way we conduct ourselves. You may agree with it, you may disagree with it. It's just the way it is. So it's sort of like a rubber band, I think of it as. It expands, it contracts, expands, contrasts rather. And so it's highly changeable. So again, you have to weed through the noise and the politics. Yeah, isn't that fun? So you have to hopefully come up with sensible and relevant policy decisions with imperfect data. Okay? So as you well know, this is the idea or the role of the IPCC. You've seen this before. And you've seen this definition just 20, 30 minutes ago from Glenn et al. In 1998. So, two definitions you've already seen: climate change and as it is viewed by the IPCC, and EV security. So you can open the idea of opening the Arctic Ocean. Is it a catalyst for conflict? Because every summer, not every summer, but for the most part, there is less ice coverage of the Arctic as there used to be. And a lot of that ice can be actually quite thin. So you can actually navigate from the Atlantic into the Pacific during summer months rather. So obviously in winter, it freezes over. So is it a fight for resources? The Russians have argued that there's oil under the ice cap in the North Pole, and they have made a claim to it. They even planted a Russian flag at the bottom of the ocean as a sort of symbolic gesture. Does that mean anything? Hard to tell. Again, politics. But the actors of the Arctic are the United States, Canada, Russia, Denmark, and Norway, because those are the countries that border it. Again, sea level rise, the latest number is 3.99 millimeters per year between the years 1993 and 2023. If you'll recall from that presentation, sea level rise is complex because it is not uniform. It is controlled by those things such as thermal expansion, freshwater inputs, the rebounding of land that was under ice during the Ice Age, which is still rebounding, so that really affects sea level on a local scale. So sea level issues are a bigger deal in the United States and the East Coast than they are on the West Coast. Okay. So here's the idea of sea level rise. So for example, a 5 to 10 meter sea level rise in the Northeast region. So New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland. Now this is an extreme example, but just gives you a sense of not only would it affect the coastline, but it would affect what we call the meadowlands. It would affect the Hudson River Valley north into places like Peekskill, because as you know, the Hudson River is especially wide. And it would affect sort of the low regions right near the border. Of course, as you head further north in the Hudson Valley, it would be less of an impact. But again, think about how many people live on the shore. New Jersey, Long Island, Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia. It's a lot of people. And of course, New York City. So think of this as a... each port is an economic node. So we're talking about the Port of Baltimore, the Port of Philadelphia, the Port of New York. So in New York, they call it the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey. And they sort of control both ports in both states. Think about the idea of sea level rise in the Gulf. So we're talking about Louisiana, we're talking about Mississippi, Texas. And so here we're talking about the idea of energy pipeline. So some of the impacts, as of 2026, 40% of the world's population lives within 62 miles or 100 kilometers of the coast. That's a big deal. That's a lot of people. 40% of 8 billion people. That's 3.2 billion people. That's a lot. Forced migration, think about places like Kiribati, the Seychelles, Bangladesh. You can have saltwater intrusion into coastline aquifers. So where people pump their fresh water from could be contaminated by seawater. Once that happens, that aquifer is done. It's dead. The infrastructure, housing, roads, businesses, homes. But people love to live near the ocean. Also habitat. Again, how fast can states adapt? And by states, in this case, I do mean like Florida, New York, Texas, California, but really you can, push this out to global states. Okay. Here's an example of New York. And again, the places that are vulnerable, and we're talking about Lower Manhattan. We're talking about what we call, Jersey City, Bayonne, inland in the Meadowlands region, Staten Island, the barrier island of Long Island towards the Rockaways, and what is present-day JFK Airport, and so on. I mean, we're talking millions and millions of people, and frankly, not billions, but probably trillions of dollars in infrastructure. And so, Hurricane Sandy, this is something from Hurricane Sandy, flooded a lot of places in New York City, especially Staten Island. And Hurricane Sandy made landfall in New Jersey, the New Jersey shore. And Hurricane Sandy was just a Category 1 storm. I mean, it was a big storm, like as an area. But it was still just a Category 1. Imagine a Category 3 or 4 hitting the same region. It's basically something that New York City is frankly unprepared to handle. And now we're talking New York City, not some lesser developed city in a place like sub-Saharan Africa. It's kind of a big deal. So here's, imagery from Sandy in 2012, and I believe this is in the far Rockaways in Long Island. And again, climate change and, think of it as wild cards. Stronger tropical cyclones. Here's some examples. Sandy, Patricia, which hit Mexico. Maria, which destroyed Puerto Rico, basically. Michael, Helene in 2024, which did so much damage in North Carolina and Tennessee. Again, are these shifting norms? What is the temporal scale of this change? So some history of natural disasters, the use of the military comes into mind. This is what's at risk. So these are economic nodes. If this risk is realized, then you have economic insecurity. And it has ripple effects into other sectors. Okay, it affects the stock market. And you might think to yourself, well, big deal. At that point, who's worried about the stock market? Well, that affects people's 401ks and retirement possibilities and healthcare. And get it? Second, third order effect. You have to, climate change is at the very, very top in this case, and there's other layers underneath it that you have to think about. Here's the 2025 $1 billion weather and climate disasters. And NOAA puts this out every year. And depends on where you are. It changes, obviously, every year. The Los Angeles wildfires, which destroyed literally 2 entire towns in Southern California. This isn't climate related. This is basically the idiocy of local and state government in California. Sorry if that sounds political, but it's true. You have drought, you have hail, you have tornadoes, tropical storms, all kinds of issues. The big southern Texas floods of 2025, which happened during the 4th of July weekend, which led to significant number of tragic deaths at camps, people who were camping for that 4th of July weekend. And again, these disasters have had $1 billion or more impacts on the region. And so there's the economic impact here. And it affects insurance rates, and it affects the ability to be insured. Because if you live near the coast in an area like Florida or the Carolinas, or really wherever you have hurricanes, your insurance bill is going to be way higher because the risk has increased. And insurance is a weird thing. You don't ever want to use insurance, but you don't want to be caught without it. And think of it as a big pot of money that's somewhere, and at some point people begin to draw from it. But if too many people begin to draw from it, you have things like people being dropped from insurance as a result of events that may have happened. I mean, this has been an issue in places like Florida with so many storms that have hit in the 2010s and 2020s so far. Again, many storms, and again, this is just to give you an idea of some of the storms. This goes back to, earthquakes. Earthquakes obviously not climate related, but you get a chance. You get a chance to realize how natural disasters can affect security, even in the most developed of places. Here's New Orleans in 2005. Still the costliest disaster in American history. And it is something that was exacerbated by levees. Remember, New Orleans was really, really poorly settled by the French. They picked the worst possible place. It may have been great for trade at the time, but it has a lake to the north, it has a river to the south, and it has the ocean to the east. And it sits below sea level. So when the levees breached, this happened. Again, from an American perspective, think about Hugo, Andrew, and Katrina, and Sandy. This is the sequence that I kind of rely on. Okay, and what these 4 have in common is they're well studied, they're progressively catastrophic, and then the U.S. military was involved in a way of assisting with the recovery. And these are other, just to give you a sense, you don't have to remember any of these, just to give you a sense of the history of military assistance and support. And again, this list is now incomplete. You could add more here and definitely more since 2018. But think about the idea of coastal populations. You know, in many cases, the coastal infrastructure on average, higher income and higher real estate values. A lot of the homes are seasonal. And a significant amount of this explosion happened during a really quiet hurricane period. It's hard for you, you may not remember this given the average age of the student in a class like this, but there was a period where the US wasn't hit by a storm for like 7 years in a row. So people get complacent, people forget. And this building boom took place, and then suddenly you went from a quiet period to a not so quiet period. The Gulf infrastructure has lots of active oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico from Texas to Alabama. You have pipelines to refineries, so these are sort of tied to the coast and then tied to the distribution of a lot of that product across the United States. So if you damage that infrastructure, suddenly gas prices spike and natural gas prices spike. And there is a lack of access to that. We've been very fortunate recently that that hasn't been the case. But whenever a storm is headed into the Gulf of Mexico or forms there, a lot of these rigs are basically abandoned. They close them up, they lock them up, and they leave. The people who are there, and they're basically not active. So they're not producing at that point. And it takes a while to get that going. So it's not a simple click, press a button, and bam, you're back in business. It takes a while to recover. And here's an example of, whether it be platform locations and pipelines, whether it be in Texas or Louisiana or Mississippi. And then this other one here, these are the economic nodes. These are the Gulf ports. Corpus Christi, Galveston, New Orleans, Tampa, Miami, Jacksonville, all the way to the port of New Jersey and New York. These are economic nodes. This is where a lot of our goods come into. So think of climate change affecting sea level rise and the ability of these places to function properly. Okay, go for that. Again, here's a what if. What if a hurricane like Rita and a hurricane like Katrina happen again? Imagine if they had happened during the summer of 2020 in the middle of COVID. Imagine if it had happened in 2008 or 9 during the financial crisis, which wasn't just a US financial crisis, it was a global financial crisis. So imagine you have two storms like this, which happened in 2005. Had they happened during this world crisis or this world crisis? So you're talking bad on top of bad. And that can be a tipping point. Even a rich country like the United States would have had a really difficult time dealing with that. That leads to instability. And instability in the United States leads to instability in Europe and across the world because we are connected globally. So, just something to think about. I'm going to stop it here. Again, this is not to make you an expert on environmental security. It is to give you a way to think about it as you hear events happening across the world. Again, climate change is not to be blamed for everything, even though you sometimes get that sense in the news. But climate change can have an exacerbating force on many things. So that's sort of what I want you to get out of this. If you have issue A, climate change, what are the following problems that will follow that? Problem B, problem C, problem D. What are the things that may be affected as a result of whatever that may be, whether it's sea level rise, stronger storms, heat, cold, drought. Again, what if? A lot of people make it their business to work on this on a daily basis. They are constantly trying to figure out, okay, states have their own response teams, as they should. And the U.S. has its own response team, as it should. And oftentimes, hopefully always, they work together. But these are people who are thinking, hopefully 3-4 steps ahead, trying to figure out how to properly address this. So keep that in mind. I hope it makes you think about the world slightly differently, because this is only going to get more complex as time goes on. So anyway, hope you had a great term. Best of luck in the final exam. And if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a great academic career, or whatever it is you're heading into post this course. Bye.